complex of enzymes, this is regulated by lots of multiple allosteric interactions, as well as covalent modifications. So remember, a covalent modification could be the transfer of a phosphate group, and that can modify the activity. Now remember, animals cannot convert acetyl-CoA back to glucose. We were saying that that was an irreversible step, so this is always going to be moving forward. So acetyl-CoA is the committed step to energy production through the citric acid cycle. This is where we're going to focus. I mentioned we also can go down the fatty acid pathway, but we're not going to focus on that. We're just going to focus on the energy aspect. So how can we regulate this? So the complex could be inhibited by high levels of acetyl-CoA. And again, as it says, inhibited, so this would be a negative feedback loop. And this should make sense, because what are we generating? We're generating the end product. So therefore, as the end product rises, it should come back and turn off the enzyme. And we've seen this again multiple times. You've got a substrate that is converted into a product. As the concentration of the product rises, it typically feeds back into the pathway to inhibit its own production. And this helps to provide another way for homeostatic control of production, a really important idea. And similarly, NADH can inhibit the dehydrogenase because this is going to be the enzyme that is involved in the process, and this is the carrier. So again, if there is a lot of NADH present, there's obviously a lot of oxidation that has occurred, and it's another way of feeding back. So as it says here, if these are present at high levels, there is no need for further metabolism. So we want to go to the off state. We want to be able to turn these things off. So if you look at the diagram here, pathways from glucose to acetyl-CoA, pyruvate dehydrogenase is the key irreversible step in the metabolism of glucose. This is going to be a very important enzyme, so please highlight this in your notes. So glucose goes to pyruvate, and we know there's glycolysis and gluconeogenesis, so we can go in this loop. But when we go from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, this is pyruvate dehydrogenase. Remember the complex of 3 enzymes? It's only going in one direction. The back reaction does not occur in animals. And so what this ends up with is either citric acid cycle and CO2 being generated, or fatty acid synthesis. And we said we're not going to talk about this side of the reaction. But you can see that fatty acids are essentially just acetyl-CoA units that combine or join together. So this is going to be fairly simple, but we're not going to cover it this semester. There is also a major regulation of the complex, and again, this is through phosphorylation. So as I used as an example above, I said that this was a good way of covalently modifying the process. And again, we have seen this multiple times, and we will see it throughout biochemistry. Phosphorylation turns off the activity. So again, this is a good example where phosphorylation is acting in a manner which is unusual, because typically, and we will see this in the signal transduction lecture, when you add a phosphate, you're turning something on generally, and by removing it, you turn it off. But not in this case. Here we add the phosphate, probably through a charge interaction or a steric hindrance, it turns off the activity. And again, that would make sense. How do we turn it on? Well, we can reverse the reaction by using the phosphatase. And this removes the phosphate group that was attached, and therefore we're able to reverse the activity. This is a classic diagram of how a kinase works. The only difference here is that we're looking at it from pyruvate dehydrogenase. So here is an active pyruvate dehydrogenase. So I've written it as in the on state. You transfer the ATP and we turn it off. Notice the shape change. So this shape change is probably due to the extra charge, as well as a steric hindrance that has been added. We take that phosphate off through a phosphatase, and this is a hydrolysis reaction because of water. We go back to the other state. So you can see, nice simple loop, very simple forward and reverse reaction, and this can also be relatively fast in its mechanism. Because just adding or removing a group is not going to be a time-consuming event, and kinases and phosphatases are very good at catalyzing those reactions. Okay, so now let's look at the control of PDH. We know how it occurs. So remember, it's the opposite of what we might expect. So we're going to look at it from an energy perspective. So if we're looking at it at rest, and we're looking at muscle, because muscle is going to be the organ that requires the most energy. So when you're resting, muscle is going to have limited energy demands, and that makes sense. Now you're listening to this lecture recording, you're probably at your desk, you might be in the library, you might be walking, you're going to have limited energy demands. So therefore, the precursor levels will be high because they're going to feed into the pathway, they're not being consumed. And so what this does is that it leads to the activation of the kinase, acting on the pyruvate dehydrogenase and turning it off. So remember, We saw that in the diagram here. Addition of the phosphate from ATP turned it off. So if we've got lots of precursors, we don't need to have the enzyme active, so we want to turn it off. If energy demands start to rise, so if you are walking and you decide, well, I'm going to run now, or there's a dog chasing you, or there's something that you need to do, your energy demands rise, the level of those precursors are going to drop because they're going to be consumed relatively quickly. We now need to generate those precursors, so we need to relieve the control on the pyruvate dehydrogenase. So the phosphatase becomes activated, it removes the phosphate, PDH activity is now restored. That should be 12.5, 12.6. So this is the regulation of PDH activity. So here you can see a high energy charge. So this means in the resting state. So you've got a high level of precursors, so a low energy demand. This is our starting point. So a lot of pyruvate going to acetyl-CoA, we want to turn that off. And the way that we can turn that off is through NADH, it's negative. Acetyl-CoA is negative, and if we've got a lot of ATP, it is negatively coming back. And this should make sense because all of these are involved in the metabolism of acetyl-CoA through the citric acid cycle. Remember, we want to go back? Can't do it. So whatever is made has to be consumed, or we have to make fatty acids. So too much acetyl-CoA turns off the enzyme, and again, it controls its own production. We've got oxidation, so NAD plus going to NADH. As this rises, it will turn it off. And similarly, whatever acetyl-CoA has been generated that goes through the citric acid cycle, the electrons lead to the conversion of ADP to ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, and we'll see that in the next lecture. So therefore, a lot of ATP is also going to come back and inhibit. So here what we're going to be doing is that the kinase will act on the PDH and turn it off. In contrast, if there is a low level of substrates or there is a great demand on energy, what are we going to see? It's going to be the opposite, isn't it? Pyruvate, if there's not a lot of precursors, pyruvate can stimulate the dehydrogenase activity. This is the substrate, it's going to activate the enzyme. Similarly, you're going to have acetyl-CoA being produced. ADP is going to be at high levels. It will stimulate PDH. Notice that ADP has the opposing effect of ATP. That stimulates further production, which in turn means that the level of ATP is going to rise. So you can see that there's a very nice control mechanism that can take place, and that this can be tailored depending on the individual substrates, but also can be tailored very quickly. Doesn't require a huge amount of time. And when you are looking at the energy production of the cell must be agile. It must be able to respond quickly, and it also must be able to limit the wastage of precursors, which is what we see here. We're able to turn it off so that we don't generate excessive substrates and we don't have a lot of energy demand on the cell or the host. Okay, we're going to stop there because we're going to move into the citric acid cycle, but make sure you understand the previous control mechanisms because they are important. Okay, welcome back. So the next major part is going to be the citric acid cycle, CAC. So remember, you've got the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or you've got the Krebs cycle. 3 different names for the same thing. Citric acid is probably one of the easier ones to remember because we can see how it interacts with the pathway. So just to give you an introduction, you need to remember carbon compounds are used as fuel that can be oxidized so they lose electrons. We're talking about glucose, pyruvate, and then acetyl-CoA as the key molecules. So acetyl-CoA is a fuel that will be metabolized. So that makes sense. What we've said here is true. Start off with our carbohydrate, convert it to one intermediate, and then ultimately remember that this was that first committed step going forward, that there was no reverse reaction. We've got oxidation or the loss of electrons. The electrons are captured. This capturing is ultimately used to generate ATP through the electron transport chain. And this will be the next lecture. Okay, so keep that in mind. What we're looking at is really the metabolism of this to generate electrons and then captured through those cofactors so that they feed into the electron transport chain. And that is where we will see ATP being generated. So the citric acid cycle uses a series of redox reactions, and because it's redox, you know that NADH, FAD, NAD+, etc. are going to be involved because these are the electron capture and carrier molecules. And this results in acetyl-CoA being converted into 2 molecules of CO2. The catabolic function of the citric acid cycle is the harvesting of high energy electrons from carbon fuels. This is the end result. This is what is occurring. We are trying to metabolize these precursors so that we can get the electrons, because the electrons are then used as part of the electron transport chain to make the ATP molecules that the cell requires. Okay? So this figure here is showing you the overview of the citric acid cycle. It starts with the entry of acetyl-CoA binding to oxaloacetate. Remember, this was the carrier molecule. So this is the 4 carbon, as it shows you here, plus our 2 carbon acetyl-CoA to give rise to our first 6 carbon intermediate. These two, it's just like maths. We're just adding these two together. A 4 carbon and a 2 carbon come together to give us 6 carbon unit. Go through this cycle, which leads to the regeneration of oxaloacetate. Notice we've got 1, 2, 3 molecules of NADH being generated, 1 molecule of FADH2, 2 molecules of CO2, and 1 molecule of ATP. Remember, this is some ATP, but the bulk of it is actually coming from the electron transport chain later. You need to know the steps of the citric acid cycle because it is so important to the basic function of the cell. So let's go through those stages. So let's summarize the 2 stages. Stage 1, and we'll start off with stage 1 and stage 2. So stage 1, 2 carbon acetyl-CoA condense with oxaloacetate, which is a 4 carbon molecule, to give rise to a 6 carbon product. When you want to remember what is the first carbon group going to be, what was the name of the pathway? Citric acid cycle. So citrate is the product that is generated. Now condensation is the same as addition. So you've got a C2 plus a C4 gives rise to a C6. So this is your acetyl-CoA, this is oxaloacetate, and this is citrate that have been generated. Okay, so whenever you see condensation, just think of it, we're just joining the 2 together, they're being added together. Citrate releases those 2 CO2 molecules that we saw and the high energy metabolism. So as it enters the cycle, these are the outputs of this, which is why when we exhale, we say that we're breathing out CO2, that's where it's coming from. Okay, it's coming from the metabolism of glucose that's going to pyruvate, which then goes to acetyl-CoA, then converted to citrate. As it goes through the pathway, CO2 is generated. In stage 2, a 4 carbon compound remains, and then this is further oxidized. So remember, there's multiple steps of oxidation, and this allows for the regeneration of oxaloacetate. Remember, the oxaloacetate is where we started. So this is the same molecule. It is just being recreated. And that's one of the benefits of having a circular pathway. That you don't have, you can have the molecules being present but not being consumed, but you can have products coming out at various points that the cell requires. Very efficient process. Now note, as we said before, citric acid cycle does not generate a lot of ATP or includes oxygen. Our main focus really is going to be on the ATP. Yes, there is some, but it is not the main powerhouse. What we are doing is that we are capturing the electrons that allow for the real production of ATP as part of the electron transport chain. So as it says here, citric acid cycle captures the electrons to form NADH and FADH2. These are the 2 critical ones that you need to know for this pathway. these molecules that have been produced now each yield 9 ATP molecules through electron transport chain, which is also called oxidative phosphorylation. So remember in the diagram before we showed 1 ATP coming out. We'll just scroll back up. There's 1 ATP here, but 1, 2, 3 molecules and 4 with the FADH, those combined give rise to 9 molecules of ATP. So you can see they're much more energy rich. They're going to feed into the pathway more effectively, and that in turn is what generates the energy in the form of ATP. Now, if we just zoom out a fraction, just so you can see the entire pathway. Now, it has the chemistry, and I don't think that's problematic. It's not really a lot of difficult chemistry that is coming along. But what you need to know are going to be the enzymes. So, here is oxaloacetate, here is acetyl-CoA. Remember, we're not showing you the whole molecule. We go back to the beginning of the lecture, it's a very large molecule, but this is that sulfur hydryl group. So we want to join the two together so you can see that there is water. So this is going to be a hydrolysis reaction. We cleave it and join it. And what do we end up with? We end up with citrate. Remember, this was the first committed step for this process. This then gets converted to isocitrate. And isocitrate, iso stands for an isomer. So we're just reorganizing. If you look at the structure, the molecules are there, but their organization is slightly different. Where they are located, how they are shown, is different. So here you've got CH2, here you've got CH in the hydroxyl group, etc. So there's a slight change in the molecule. So that's the first step. You then have isocitrate dehydrogenase. And notice we've got NAD plus going to NADH and CO2. So this is the first capture of a proton, and we've also got a decarboxylation reaction that has occurred. That was the first step. And remember, this is an energy intensive molecule that is, well, not energy intensive, but something that has energy potential to make ATP. That gives rise to alpha ketoglutarate. And we go through another dehydrogenase step. And notice this is complex. This is not just going to be a single enzyme, but we're going, that's more detail than I think you need to know. So again, just another dehydrogenase reaction. So what are we going to do? The same thing. NAD plus goes to NADH, and we lose another CO2 molecule because we need to get rid of these carbons, and we do this through this decarboxylation. This gives rise to succinyl-CoA. So we've added a coenzyme CoA group. So this is succinyl. So succinyl-CoA synthetase to give us succinate. So the name is telling you what it is. We undergo another round of dehydrogenation, but rather than NADH, this is where FAD comes into play, and it gains 2 protons. This gives rise to fumarate, and those are getting smaller and smaller, the number of carbons, 1, 2, and 3. Fumarate is acted on by fumarase to give us malate. Malate is dehydrogenated once more to generate our last molecule of NADH to give us back to oxaloacetate. And we've now got the entire cycle. But what you can see is 1 molecule of NADH, 2 molecules of NADH, 3 molecules of NADH, and our 4th molecule of energy-rich protons, but in the form of FADH2. And here is our single ATP molecule that is generated here. So you can see the pathway is relatively simple. It's just got a lot of dehydrogenation reactions essentially, and a cyclical process. So try to remember the names, because you'll be able to remember, well, citrate goes to isocitrate, and then the interconversions, and some of these are going to be fairly simple to do. But it is important to understand this pathway. And also, obviously, the importance of oxaloacetate and acetyl-CoA as they feed in, but also the outputs of these different molecules as they are coming out, because they will come into the next cycle. Okay, let me just show this part, and then we'll stop for this part of the recording. This is an overview of how acetyl-CoA feeds into the citric acid cycle. The electrons, which remember we're in NADH, FADH2, this is where they were captured, enter oxidative phosphorylation, and this is where ATP is created. So if we look here on the left-hand side, we are still in the matrix of the mitochondria. So you can see in a mitochondrial membrane, we've got fatty acids coming in. Fatty acids can generate a lot of acetyl-CoA. So can amino acids. These will be in subsequent lectures, but what we're talking about is glucose at this stage. Glucose goes to pyruvate, pyruvate goes to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA interacts with oxaloacetate and goes through the cycle, and we generate our 1 molecule of ATP. It's a little bit, but not a lot. We've got those 2 decarboxylation, and we've got the 3 NADH and the 1 FADH molecules. And these are the players. These are the ones that we okay, welcome back. So this is where we finished. Let's go into a detailed explanation. Nothing new. We're just going to go break down that pathway into the individual steps. So remember we had stage 1. Stage one was acetyl-CoA, which has 2 carbons coming into the pathway. So this is where synthase, remember it synthesizes citrate. It takes oxaloacetate through a condensation reaction, which is a 4 carbon, to use citrate, which is a 6 carbon. So we've got acetyl-CoA plus oxaloacetate to give our C6 citrate. This is being synthesized, hence we're using a synthase. Citrate then undergoes that first round of decarboxylation. So we're going to remove the CO2, and this gives us a 4 carbon product because we've taken off CO2. We've lost that CO2, and we've also generated NADH. So here is oxaloacetate, got 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. We've got 1 and 2 in acetyl-CoA. Remember, this group here is really the tail portion of the acetyl-CoA, or the coenzyme, and this is the molecule that we are interested in. So the first thing is this intermediate citral-CoA. Don't worry about this one too much. This is one of those intermediate steps. This is the one that we are really interested in. So just to make things a little bit easier, let's ignore that one for now. You then join the 2. We need to get rid of that last component, which is a hydrolysis reaction, and we've now added the 2 together. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Oh, and 6 there, because that's where our 6 carbon is going to be. Okay, so this is our, so the order is not right, 4, 5, and 6 there. Okay, so that's that first reaction. Remember that we said that citrate then becomes isomerized to isocitrate. Why? Because the configuration is not optimal for energy production. The product that is generated is good, but it's not the best. So the cell just modifies its organization. So here is the second reaction. Citrate goes to another intermediate, and again, this is the end product, isocitrate. So we lose water, and then we add water. So the net result is that there is 0 change, but the locations have changed. We've got hydrogen, hydroxyl group, we've got a hydroxyl and a hydrogen group. We've swapped them around. So remember that this is the isomer of citrate. That's all we're doing. Nothing really complicated here. We're just making it into something which is more energy productive for the pathway. The enzyme that does this is convertase. So it does both the dehydration, which is the removal, and the hydration reactions. So it's able to remove the water and then just add it back, but at a different location. Now, when we think about the next steps, the next step is the first of the 4 redox reactions that take place. And this is the important part, because this is where we're going to get our byproducts, our NADH, our FADH2. So isocitrate is oxidatively decarboxylated. So undergoes redox reaction. So here is isocitrate. We've got NAD plus going to NADH and our proton. So we lose this group, we lose this group. This carbon no longer has the same valency. You can see that it now has this double bond that has been generated here to maintain that balance. And this is oxalosuccinate as the intermediate. We haven't yet decarboxylated it, so this is the group here. We lose that as CO2, and we end up with alpha ketoglutarate. The proton is there simply to maintain the valency for that carbon. And so we have the group here. If we didn't, this would be CH. It would not be balanced, but that's where the extra proton has gone to make it CH2. So this is alpha ketoglutarate. We have resulted from this the generation of our first molecule of NADH. We repeat the process, so there's another oxidative decarboxylation reaction. It takes alpha ketoglutarate, just 5 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this converts it to succinyl-CoA, which is a 4 carbon unit. And again, that should make sense because we are losing 1 carbon to CO2. That carbon is lost, so therefore the 5 must go to a 4 carbon structure. And we see that here. Alpha ketoglutarate, NAD+, and we're adding CoA. So this carboxyl group is lost. Remember, COO is the same as CO2. It is lost. The proton has been stripped. It's gone to NADH, and we've added the CoA unit to make succinyl-CoA. And this again facilitates the next reactivity. Leads to the loss of CO2, formation of another NADH, and is catalyzed by another dehydrogenase. Alpha ketoglutarate, which is the substrate, and this is the functionality, which remember is to remove that proton on the CO2, is the dehydrogenase. Now what about stage 2? Stage 2 is the regeneration of oxaloacetate. So remember, stage 1 is the entry, stage 2 is the regeneration of oxaloacetate, which is really important for the whole process to occur. Now, succinyl-CoA has a high energy thioester bond, which is present here. So the action of succinyl-CoA synthetase leads to the generation of a molecule of ATP, and this is the only molecule that we're really going to, well, that we see in this pathway. And as it says here, only step where a molecule of ATP is generated. So succinyl-CoA, we add phosphate to ADP, you add those two, you know you're going to generate ATP, and we lose the CoA group to regenerate, or generate, I should say, succinate. So we've lost that group, gone back to the COO minus. That then has to be oxidized to regenerate the oxaloacetate. And now we have the generation of FADH2 and NADH. And this occurs first, the FADH2, followed by the last NADH. So succinate goes to fumarate. We lose these two protons to generate FAD to make FADH2. Fumarate, 2, 3, 4 carbon. We have a hydrolysis reaction, which when you do so is going to add the hydroxyl group and regenerate that proton. We go through the process again. So now malate goes to oxaloacetate. So here we've got NAD plus going to NADH and our free proton. And again, we introduce these double bonds just to maintain the valency. So what is the net result? What is the end result of all of this? We have one molecule of acetyl-CoA. We have 3 NAD pluses because we know that we generate them later. We've got one molecule of FAD, an ADP, a phosphate, and some water coming in. And we generate our 2 molecules of CO2. We generate our 3 NADH molecules that come into the electron transport chain, 1 molecule of FADH, which also combines, and 1 molecule of ATP, 2 protons, and our CoA that can go back and rejoin with the acetyl unit to allow the process to continue. So hopefully with that explanation, it all makes a bit more sense in terms of the process, the generation points. Remember, NADH, NADH, then FADH2, and then lastly NADH. We've got stage 1 and stage 2, and those key control points. You really have to understand this entire cycle. Okay, let's stop there. I'll see you in the next recording. Okay, welcome back. So now let's move on to talk about how we regulate the citric acid cycle. We've gone through the pathway, we've gone through stage 1, stage 2. How do we regulate the pathway? Because it is so important. So entry into the cycle and the rate of the cycle are controlled at several stages. This should make sense. It is such a critical cycle within the cell. You really need to make or have adequate control at multiple points. Now, pyruvate can generate acetyl-CoA. It's not the only source, and we saw this in the previous diagram. If I scroll back up, way up, so if we go all the way up to here, we said that glucose goes to acetyl-CoA, and then I said to you that fatty acids and amino acids can also feed in to make acetyl-CoA. That is the reference point. This is just showing you glucose is not the only molecule that can make acetyl-CoA. We've got others. And remember that fatty acids are very high energy molecules because they can undergo multiple rounds of reduction and they generate a lot of acetyl-CoA. They're basically acetyl-CoA building blocks. And so can amino acids. But again, that will be the nature of a future lecture. So fatty acids undergo degradation through a process called beta oxidation, and they make huge amounts of acetyl-CoA. And we saw that in that diagram. But what are the control points that we're interested in? Well, the primary control points are all allosteric enzymes. And again, we've seen this time and time again. Allosteric enzymes simply mean that the byproducts of the reaction can come back and can inhibit the enzyme. So importantly, isocitrate dehydrogenase, alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. These are those key molecules. So if we go back to the diagram, let's go back to the cycle. Here we go. Isocitrate dehydrogenase, alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. They're going to be the points of control. At least one set of control points. Now, isocitrate dehydrogenase is again allosterically stimulated by ADP. What does that mean? Well, we can stimulate the pathway because if ADP is low, energy is needed. Okay, so it indicates the need for more energy in the form of ATP. Similarly, if NADH levels are high, this will inhibit isocitrate dehydrogenase because this is the end product. This has been generated through that metabolism. So if this is high, when we're in a cycle, we know that things are feeding through and the process is moving ahead. So we've got this reciprocal control. Reciprocal control. Remember, this is a really important concept. And the example that I like to use is if you think about a car has an accelerator, a car has a brake pedal. They are both important because you need to be able to move, but stopping is just as important. Just as in an enzymatic reaction, you need the reaction to go forward, or you want to stimulate a reaction through an allosteric control. You also need to be able to inhibit through an allosteric control as well. So they're both important. What about alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase? It's similar to what we've seen before. It is inhibited by the products, so succinyl-CoA and NADH, as well as high levels of ATP. Same idea, just different players in the process. So substrates or products that are generated, as they go up, they inhibit, no different to what we saw here with the NADH. And similarly here, before we said, well, if ADP was low, we needed to make energy. Here we're just saying, well, if ATP is high, we want to turn it off. Same thing, just looking at it from a different angle. So make sure you understand that because these are really the two control points that are very important. There are also inhibition of other stages that affect other metabolic pathways. So inhibition of isocitrate dehydrogenase leads to an increase in citrate. Remember, this is what we started with. This was citrate binding to oxaloacetate. This blocks phosphofructokinase and stops glycolysis. What does that do? It stops the feeding in to the pathway. So this is how we have to now link this to our previous control point. So citrate is going to be the byproduct of acetyl-CoA plus oxaloacetate. So this needs to feed back to stop this coming through. Because remember, glucose goes to pyruvate, which goes to acetyl-CoA. And we saw citrate playing a role in glycolysis. So by doing so, we have this control mechanism. There's layer upon layer of controls that we have to think about. So let's look at this diagram. Control points of the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle is regulated mainly by ATP and NADH, and we saw that in the previous section. Key control enzymes, isocitrate and alpha-ketoglutarate, which are both dehydrogenase enzymes. So as I mentioned to you before, glucose comes in, generates pyruvate. Pyruvate goes with to generate acetyl-CoA. These two combine to make our citrate, and we said the citrate can come back and inhibit. So ATP, acetyl-CoA and NADH, these will all inhibit this coming through because this is indicative of high levels of energy, so you don't need to feed this through. Similarly, if ADP and pyruvate are high, that means that there's an excess of either a lack of energy or an excess of precursor. We want them to feed into the pathway. Here we've got isocitrate dehydrogenase, and here we've got alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, and we've got the same idea. High levels of ATP and NADH mean that there's a lot of energy, so we want to turn this off. If ADP is high, it means that there's a lot of precursors or energy is low. And down here, same idea. ATP, succinyl-CoA, which is this precursor, is able to come back and inhibit the enzyme. So this is another clear allosteric control, as well as NADH, which is one of the byproducts, again, helping to reinform this process and turning it off.